think you sort of sidestepped it because we were in the middle of a discussion of a particular case, but about the effect on families. Obviously, you talked to Dennis Martin's father. He's still affected by it years later. You must see that a lot as you talk to family members, people who were tortured even years or decades later by these losses.
You know, as I was walking away from Mr. Martin's house, he had tears in his eyes. We had tears in our eyes. Honestly, I drove back with my partner, and I told him that in 30 years of investigating cases, talking to people in the workplace, being a police officer, that was the hardest conversation I've ever had with anybody. And, you know, maybe before I was a dad, it wouldn't have been as difficult, but I felt his pain, and I could see how he had essentially probably ruined this poor man's life with his wife, because it wasn't that far from his house that this happened. You know, it's probably an hour's drive. He never moved. He lived at the same house, and in fact, unbelievably, had the same phone number. And I'm sure that in the back of his mind, he was always hoping that Dennis was going to come back. And I think as a parent, you've got to always have hope or some type of closure. I mean, not knowing has to be one of the worst things for these people.
It must tear the families apart, too. The wife says, Dad, you were watching the kid. It's your fault. It's your fault. Or the guilt that's involved in that must rip these families apart.
Oh, there's no doubt. When you do the investigation and you start looking at many of the facts of these cases, what struck me is that every one of these dads on every one of these cases where these kids were never found, I'm telling you, they gave it the heroic effort to hang in there and to keep going and never to give up and to try and to be out there beating the bush every day. I thought, well, maybe it wouldn't happen as frequently, but every case I ran into, I mean, these fathers that were there, they never gave up. They didn't want to go home. You could just feel it.
You know, in reading the books, Missing 411, it doesn't seem to be any sort of demographic consistency about the people who are taken. And I'm just wondering, is there any obvious links? I mean, it sounds like there are, well, for example, Pennsylvania, you mentioned the cluster with a lot of kids who had vanished, but there weren't all kids who were vanished in that area, right? There were some adults as well. And I'm just wondering, in that context, are there any similarities? It's across the board in terms of age and race, sex, DNA. I don't know. Is there anything that ties them together?
Well, talk about race for a second. It's very, very rare when you see somebody disappear other than a Caucasian. There were a couple of black people. Up until just recently, I had never seen an Asian person that had disappeared and not been found. And there was a professor from Oregon that was hiking alone just recently, within the last couple of years, and he disappeared. He was never found, and it's probably going to fall right into the criteria that we've set down. We're looking at that real hard. But no, it's mostly Caucasian. But wealthy, poor, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's a case out in New York we'll talk about later where a boy disappeared. One of the wealthiest families in the U.S. So no. It does seem as though, and it might have been the times, that families, large families, seem to have kids that disappear more frequently than small families. And in talking amongst ourselves, we were starting to think that maybe that was an issue of the times in the 40s and the 50s, late 30s, especially for rural people, farmers, ranchers, and things. Having a large family was almost mandatory. And versus today in a city dweller, having 10, 11 kids isn't very normal.
Back to Pennsylvania. Kids mostly disappeared, but you have a case of Marjorie West. Tell me about that one.
And Marjorie is one of those cases I was just talking about that disappeared on the northern side of this wilderness designation in the northwestern part of Pennsylvania. She was with her family, and her dad was fishing in a small creek. Mom was sitting in a car. Girls were picking wildflowers, and she got out of sight just momentarily. And prior to that, her dad had said, hey, don't play by those big boulders because there's sometimes snakes there. And her sister thought that she walked over by this boulder. And it was one of those brief, and she's gone. And right around where Marjorie disappeared, there's another boy disappeared probably within 15 miles under equally strange circumstances and was never found. Absolutely a huge search for these people and absolutely nothing. No clothing, no nothing. And Marjorie's case played headlines for a number of months. And it's just one of those perplexing things that a few seconds out of your sight, and these boulders come up many times when you're in the woods. Either evidence is found in or near them, or people are in amongst them, and something happens. And going back to Yosemite real quick, Yosemite's covered by miles and miles of huge granite and exposed granite. And a lot of times these people are disappearing in amongst areas where there isn't a lot of cover. There's a lot of boulders. It's an interesting dilemma to think about.
Let's talk about Douglas Legg. I know that was a case that really got under your skin.
So Douglas and Dennis have a lot of similarities in my mind.